One of the most enduring and debated aspects of 1997's Final Fantasy VII is the love triangle that forms between the three key characters of our protagonist Cloud Strife, his childhood friend Tifa, and the mysterious supernatural girl who joins their adventure, Aerith, which, as we'll explore here, has shifted over time from a nebulous, subjective element of the game to one that's written more definitively across the expanded Final Fantasy VII media. Now, in the original game, I think this is one of the most brilliantly written interpersonal relationships and interpersonal narrative ambiguities to be seen in an RPG, and Final Fantasy was pretty good at these generally. You know, if we look at Shadow in Final Fantasy VI or Laguna in Final Fantasy VIII, and the ambiguities of the stories there. But the love triangle in Final Fantasy VII was fantastic because the complexity of the situation came as much from how the writers played with romantic narrative tropes and thus expectations, as it did from the player's input and the player's subjective opinions and indeed decisions in the game to try and influence this love triangle one way or another. So, looking to the narrative tropes that play out, on the one hand, with regards to Tifa's character, we have the classic childhood girl next door scenario, where she grows up alongside Cloud, and there's a certain connection and fatedness with that makes them perhaps seem destined to be together. And this is doubly so since, as discussed in my Tifa character episode, since Nibelheim and its inhabitants were all destroyed, all that Tifa and Cloud have to sort of reaffirm their identities and validate their own pasts and experiences is indeed one another. So the inseparable importance and coexistence of these two characters is doubled down as the game progresses, and this can very easily be interpreted in a romantic sense. On the other hand, we have Aerith, and Aerith is introduced in another classic romantic trope, which is the meet cute, and everything from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet to Hollywood rom-coms of the 1990s have indulged in this notion of the incidental clash or humorous crossing of paths of two individuals who would go on to form a romantic relationship. And so Cloud crashing through the roof of Aerith's church after the Airbuster boss battle, waking up to Aerith looking over him, this is a classic example of this meet cute scenario. And again, probably one of the best examples of it that I've seen in game storytelling. Although from a more functional perspective, many players are quick to point out that the actual first meeting with Aerith is when she tries to sell us a flower right at the beginning of the game, which I discount firstly as a more mechanical decision, because your response will dictate the date sequence without knowing anything about her personality first, but it's also a classic Final Fantasy convention of alluding to future party members through cameo. And another great example of that is Shadow in Final Fantasy VI. And these are often characters where we kind of see their picture in the game manual, so we know that they're obtainable, but we don't quite know how to acquire them when we first meet them. Beyond this, and focusing more on traditional Final Fantasy romances and Final Fantasy character types, we find that more often than not, the romantic female lead is the one who is attuned to magical or mystical attributes, whether that's the summoners Garnet and Yuna in Final Fantasy IX and X respectively, sorceress Rinoa in Final Fantasy VIII, the Oracle Luna in Final Fantasy XV, and so on. So Aerith being the only surviving ancient with knowledge and powers connected to the planet, they slot her into this romantic Final Fantasy archetype, and combined with the aforementioned meet cute, they just reinforce this sort of romantic inclination for some players. So that's the setup for the original game, and as the story unfolds, players discover more about their personalities, with Tifa being this caring, almost matronly childhood friend who worries about Cloud, and Aerith being this spunky, adventurous, optimistic, magical girl. So brilliantly written, polarizing personalities and identities here, and it's largely left to the player to determine how they feel about these characters and sway the relationships one way or another through the dialogue options. And that was the long and short of the original game. It was ultimately quite ambiguous, and regardless of which way you fall on Aerith or Tifa, if you care at all, that was how it was, and it was great, and one of the reasons that it's still debated and discussed to this day. coming to the compilation material, one thing that I really liked was how this stuff built out the characters for the most part, built out the character relationships in certain ways, but maintained the ambiguity in others. And so it allowed players to develop their ideas and opinions of the characters even more without kind of having a definitive answer one way or another. So for example, the relationship between Zack and Aerith, which is explored quite thoroughly in Crisis Core, was great. And for me personally, looking back to Final Fantasy VII proper, having played Crisis Core, where Cloud was adopting all of these traits of Zack and living out this mercenary life in his confusion, which was Zack's dream, there is a certain poetic irony for me that he had attracted Zack's girlfriend Aerith too. So for me, I reinterpreted the love triangle of Final Fantasy VII proper as simply symptomatic of Cloud's muddled half-life between the true Cloud and being a false Zack. And conversely, we could see Aerith perhaps projecting somewhat onto Cloud because of this boyfriend that she lost. So I liked that, and while it's purely me projecting my own theories and opinions onto events, that's precisely what these scenarios should be doing, and leaving that room for player interpretation is what makes these aspects of Final Fantasy so memorable and enduring for players that are invested in these characters, and again, why we are still discussing them today. Now, coming to the newer installments of Final Fantasy VII, and specifically Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, there seem to be clearer nods than ever, I think, towards a definitive canon of Cloud and Tifa, and conversely, of course, Zack and Aerith, which is evidenced in numerous interactions, which, without overt spoilers, I think comes into the weighting of the story and the direction taken with these characters' interactions, and in particular Tifa's relationship to Cloud taking up huge sections of the story, and actually becoming one of the major narrative hooks that we are left to contend with, and is kind of a cliffhanger for the third installment, really. So it's interesting that the love triangle was formerly like a bit part and a subplot of the original game, and now it's actually kind of inching its way really thoroughly into the main events, particularly with Sephiroth actually mentioning it to Cloud and sort of taunting him with discussions about Tifa. So this, paired with companion material, such as Kazushige Nojima's Traces of Two Pasts, further builds out these character relationships, but rather than necessarily retaining their former ambiguity, they seem to be steering them much more towards something that's weighted towards a Cloud and Tifa as canon. So for me, as with many players, I do have my own preference in the Tifa Aerith scenario, but regardless of my own opinions and regardless of which side you fall on, I actually think it would be of detriment to clarify these affections one way or another, because I think some of the best and most memorable stories across various media become so in part because of certain ambiguities and events that are left to be interpreted by the audience. And it's almost like an audience participation exercise that allows people to debate and make sense of the outcomes one way or another. So looking at films, one of the most memorable examples of a literal cliffhanger is The Italian Job. We also have Reservoir Dogs, Inception, all of these sort of films that end without a definitive answer. And then we have TV series such as Game of Thrones, which was dissected and debated relentlessly as it was being released around the origins of one of the main characters, Jon Snow, and what his true birth may or may not have been. So these examples show that the strengths of good storytelling is as much in what's not told as what is, and I really think a strength of many Final Fantasy games is the speculation that emerges in the strategically placed absences and ambiguities of certain character arcs. So for example, looking to other games, we have the relationship between Squall and Laguna in Final Fantasy VIII, which is hinted at but never outrightly said or spoken in the game at all. We have Realm and Shadow in Final Fantasy VI, and we have Jecht and Aurin's origin stories in Final Fantasy X, and all of these elements continue to provoke ideas and debates and discussions among fans. Even though some of these games are like 10, 15, 20 years old, they continue to provoke ideas and discussions and tantalizingly hint at an untold story that if the writers were to draw back the curtain and tell us what happened, it might not fulfill us in the same way that the ongoing speculation does. So that's a key takeaway and consideration from me from having played Rebirth, and for this Cloud and Tifa, and indeed Cloud and Aerith scenario that has sort of re-emerged in the wake of the narrative pivot that this game has taken. So perhaps it's pedantry on my part, and I'm reading too much into it, but I did have this worry that the writers are perhaps in danger of compromising what is an age-old, much-loved element of the original game, if they opt to conclude the game with a definitive answer one way or another. On the other hand, many may argue that it's been such a long time coming that perhaps they should, for example, show a happy ever after with Cloud and Tifa or whatever. But personally, I do feel there is a fine line to be had between building out a story and saying too much in a story. So that's my takes on the value of ambiguity here. But as I say, I'm sure many players may want answers in some form or another as this reimagined story takes place.